So this is doing your Jewish genealogy, I guess, part 2. Trying to do these somewhat in some kind of chronological, well, in the order of sort of building ideas upon each other as I move forward. We'll see how successful I am in doing that. So today's episode, what I want to say to you first and foremost is, if your Jewish family is now Western and moved here around 1900, their name was not messed up at Ellis Island or wherever they arrived in the West from the East. So here's a couple of family stories in my own family. So when my aunt's ancestor, I think her grandpa, came to America and arrived at Ellis Island, they asked him his name, and he said proudly, "I am a free man," and they wrote down his last name as Freeman. Okay. When my great-grandfather arrived in America, well, Jews didn't traditionally have last names, so when they asked him for his last name, well, he was illiterate and he didn't understand the question either because it was in English, so he said, "I am Itzik of Yasin," and they wrote down Isaac Yasvin, and that's how he got his last name. So these are lovely stories, but they're not true. I have heard these stories over and over again from Jewish families, and I'm imagining that a lot of other families whose ancestors came over to Ellis Island or in any of the other ports to America, to Canada, and maybe some other Western countries as well, that they also have these stories. They are not true. I was just as shocked as anybody else to hear this. The Ellis Island and these other ports of entry required proper documentation of a person's last name for it to be written down in the American or Western documentation. I keep saying American because the vast majority of Jewish refugees, and let's not kid ourselves, they were refugees, not merely immigrants. The vast majority did come through Ellis Island, although there were other ports of entry as well. They had the documentation here in the West had to have their correct and actual names on it. Now, it is true that traditionally Jews did not have last names, but that custom was no longer in practice in Eastern Europe. Around 1800, give or take, in first Central Europe and then Eastern Europe. It's true Jews at that time did not traditionally have last names. They would be known as, for example, Moshe the Redhead in either the language of their country or perhaps in Yiddish, which was the day-to-day spoken language of Jews at the time. So there might be like Moshe the barber, Moshe the redhead, Moshe the tailor, or there might be Moshe from that village over there with that other name, or Moshe whose mother came from that other place. So that's how they were known. But around 1800, governments started imposing in order to impose more efficient taxation on Jews, they required Jews to have last names so they could keep better records. So at that time, sometimes Jews were just given last names, but a lot of the time they were allowed to choose their last names, and often they would choose their last names based on how they were already known. So I think Roth something means red, so red Roth something would be the red or redhead or whatever, which, by the way, as an aside, Jews are the third most likely ethnic group to have red hair. But anyway, I digress. That's Ashkenazi Jews. So my family, for example, my father's grandfather's family, I think must have been known as the guys from that town over there, that little village that's just a little ways away, that's called Yosvenia, or in Yiddish, Yasven. And so the family's last name became something like Yasven. So by the time Jewish refugees were making their way to the West, they actually did have last names that were in all kinds of documents, and this had been the family's last name for a few generations by then, and they would use them in official proceedings, and they would have to have documents showing that this was their last name when they arrived in the West. However, what definitely did change a lot and often was spellings of these names. So, for example, my family's last name originally was something like Yasven. We can't be sure. And I have found 40 or more different English spellings of that name. You got to remember that you've got a population that is, at the time, functioning predominantly in Yiddish, which uses the Hebrew alphabet, or Aleph Bet, but uses it slightly differently than it's used in Hebrew. So, for example, my last name, the V sound in Yasven would have been a double Vav, which, okay, if you don't know Hebrew, just don't worry about that. Whereas in Hebrew it would have been depicted a bit differently. They're also moving from alphabet to alphabet. They probably would all have to have a Russian spelling of their name at certain times, depending on who owned which part of which land. They would have to maybe have a German spelling of their last name, Lithuanian spelling, Ukrainian spelling. So they're moving back and forth between languages and alphabets and sort of guesstimating how the spelling would work in these new languages. And that would also be the case as they move to America. It's not so much that they might misspell it, but that the people at Ellis Island would be transliterating from whatever documents they had into English. Some of the sounds just wouldn't transliterate exactly. And some of the sounds, it was kind of up in the air. There are certain letters that, let's say in Hebrew, it could be a B or it could be a V. So I have, for example, seen my last name spelled Yasbain with a B instead of Yasvain with a V. Or some of you who know any Spanish know that the Y and the J sounds are kind of interchangeable sometimes. Well, same for a lot of our ancestors. So I've seen my last name spelled with a J, Jasvain or Jasven or something like that, or Yashvin, or just on and on it goes. My point is, sorry, I think I'm going on a little too long. My point is that the names are the same, but I strongly advise you to be extremely open and loosey-goosey about spellings. You may find that you're wrong, and that a group of people who you think has the same last name as you but spelled differently is not actually family. But be willing to give it a shot and see. Once people were in the new country, yes, some family did change the name entirely so that they would sound less Jewish and therefore deal with less anti-Semitism. So, for example, I found one branch of my family that changed the name from Yasven to Young. So that definitely doesn't sound ethnic-y, whatever that means. More often, the families would do something like drop an Eastern European sounding ending to the last name. So you'll see a lot of people whose last names went from, say, Feinstein to Fine. which they thought sounded less Jewish, but of course now Fine is seen as a typical Jewish name as well. Another example, some of the people in my family went from Bloomin to Bloom. Again, Bloom became known as a Jewish name as well, but their initial intent was to sound more American, which to them meant less Jewish. So, if I find someone whose name is Bloom, not Bloomin, I'm not going to assume that they're not a relative because of that small change. There was also things like in Poland, they often would add ski to the end of the name, so I've seen my name spelled Jasvenski, but then as soon as they would leave that area, they would drop that ending all over again and just become Jasven again. So those are some things to think about when you're looking at family. So when you go looking in the old country documents, which you will find predominantly on a site called jewishgen.org, and I will be talking about them a lot more as we go forward. But when you go looking for your older documents, know that your name, the last name of the family, is the real last name. The last name on documents when they first arrived here, if you are someone here doing this research, that is their real last name, and there will be some documentation of them using that name from the old country, but it might be spelled in any number of ways. So that's the main thing to take away. Now, people will ask why, if this is not true, if names were not messed up at Ellis Island and other places, why is that story so persistent in so many Jewish families? I have some theories. I don't actually know. Someone who's a scholar in this probably would be able to tell you for sure, but my theory is kind of twofold. I think that they didn't want us finding our European family. Our family here did not want us finding our European family, and I think there was probably two reasons. Initially, I think that they wanted to spare us the pain of what was still happening to the family in Eastern Europe. So I imagine most of you watching this know about the pogroms. These were still going on. There's a big reason why most of our ancestors left. The families would still have been enduring pogroms and a great deal of systematic anti-Semitism. Really, really severe stuff. I thought I understood, and I was shocked by how bad it was. But so I think they didn't want their juniors to contact family in the East and learn how bad it really was. They wanted just a fresh start. So they would say, oh, no, they messed up our name at Ellis Island, when they didn't. But I think that another big reason, don't forget that the Soviet Revolution happened in 1917, and pretty much immediately, anyone in the Soviet Union who had Western family was considered suspect, because that family would be considered capitalist, and now in the Soviet Union was communist. Now, who had a lot of Western family at the time? Well, Jews did, because so many Jews had left as refugees from anti-Semitism. So you had all these Jews who had Western family who were immediately suspect and potentially in danger simply by virtue of having Western family. And then when Stalin came in and lost his head and began, I think, what they call the Great Purge in Russia, he started executing great numbers of people that he decided were a danger to the Soviet Union for whatever reason, executing and sending them and or their families to gulags, sort of prison work camps that were kind of like death camps in, I believe, the north of the Soviet Empire. So at that point, people in the East, our family who was left behind, their letters to the West started. They were stopping. We weren't getting as many letters, and the message was received here in the West through some letters that did get through, and through some bits of information, and I'm sure they talked to each other. It's not safe for that family to have Western family. So on both sides, on the East and the West, the families cut off contact with each other, stopped talking to their juniors about the other family, and I'm guessing in the West started lying about what our last names were. So if you say to your family here, oh yeah, they screwed up our name at Ellis Island. Our name is not really Bloom. I don't know what our real name was. It's lost in time. Then there's less of a danger of Western family contacting Eastern family, and therefore putting that family in danger of execution, jail, persecution, etc. That's my theory. I think it's got some merit. So I guess that's where I'm going to stop. That's actually a lot of information, but the takeaway from this that I want you to have, there's two takeaways I want you to have. One, your name was not messed up at Ellis Island or any other port in the West. And by the West, I do include places like Argentina, Brazil, sort of, South Africa, any of the places that families ran to get away from the pogroms in Eastern Europe. So number one, your name was not messed up, your last name. That is your last name. The family did have that last name in Europe for probably about 100 years. There are documents using that last name about your family in Eastern Europe. And here's number two. Okay, that looks like four, but these were nuances of number one. Number two, be flexible about spellings. The spellings will be all over the place. One family, you could find the name spelled 5 different ways. And one more thing I want to add. When volunteers in Eastern Europe are transcribing these documents onto documents that will go online, putting them into English from Russian, from German, from Yiddish, from Hebrew, from whatever, they might transliterate them differently themselves. So they might spell them differently 3 different times in 2 different documents or something. So be flexible about spelling. Okay, I'm a little worried I might have overwhelmed with this amount of information. So please put comments below. And by comments, I mean questions, if you have some, and comments. Okay, hopefully that was fairly clear. All right, salut for now.